Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, and this is Coffee and Wisdom. This week, we are asking the question. Last week, we were talking about how are we going to live in this new world with the reduced effects of monotheisms out there. And this week, we've been thinking about rethinking what we need. How will the assumptions of the world change now that things are working in a different direction. We all know that there are some issues and challenges in the United States at the moment. How to deal with those is a very good question. One thing that we definitely have talked about a lot on Coffee and Wisdom is the idea of a new way of thinking about religion. And that's kind of across the board in terms of many, many different religions. I've talked before about a rising idea of religious naturalism and animism, even among fairly mainline Christians. Here's a book just as an example, Black Lives and Sacred Humanity Toward an African-American Religious Naturalism. We really live in a very, very fruitful time at the moment in terms of rethinking how theology can work, all the way from the nuns to secular people entirely, to people who are spiritual but not religious, and to the religions of no religion, as it's being called these days. Another thing, and we talked about this yesterday, we need a new way of thinking about growth and economics. Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think of Like a 21st Century Economist by Kate Raworth is really a seminal work and has begun a totally new kind of conversation about how growth can work and what it means within our social structures, meaning that the donut, the outside of that is the natural limits to the amount of natural resources we can use before we start doing irreparable damage to the earth, which, guess what, does irreparable damage to human beings sooner or later. Also, as part of that, a new way of thinking about cities. You see this little ad. You've heard of the circular economy. Now meet the circular city. Berlin is now a circular city. Several are. London is looking into it. This is not as much a part of U.S. thinking at the moment, but it may be, because certainly it's very popular in Europe as a way of rethinking how cities work. Chicago has taken strides toward that, and you notice what's happening here. We have rooftop gardens that not only produce nice green plants, but it also changes the dynamic of how heat is emanated back into the atmosphere from cities. And so the idea of a circular city using its own waste products to produce energy and beginning to be as close to carbon neutral as possible. So we are coming up with new ways of thinking about how cities work. I mentioned a book yesterday that came out in November from Robert Putnam, The Upswing, and it's a new way of thinking about community, or at least we should say a way of looking at how community has worked in the United States. Most of you know Robert Putnam's work. Bowling Alone from the year 2000 was absolutely seminal and a new way of talking about how American society worked. The fact is that it wasn't working all that well. And here he was talking about that as a way, to consider it. This is a quote from Putnam. "Community connectedness is not just about warm, fuzzy tales of civic triumph. In measurable and well-documented ways, social capital makes an enormous difference in our lives. Social capital makes us smarter, healthier, safer, richer, and better able to govern a just and stable democracy. It's better for all of us. It's better for our society itself to have community connectedness." And that's been a very central aspect of Putnam's work over time. He, in Bowling Alone, traced the rise and decline of league bowling as kind of the lead edge of how this worked. League bowling peaks in a little bit after 1960, and that point on the graph is going to become very important as we talk about this morning in about 1964. So we begin to ask what happened in 1964. The rise of participation in social institutions. Now you're going to see a peak at about 1960. The gold line is American homes with television. All right, and I mean that's one of the factors that's going to figure into the American social scene. You see that league bowling is going to drop off. That's the little triangles. It's going to drop off precipitously. Church attendance is going to begin a slow but steady decline, and PTA attendance also going down. So the civic engagement going down, people sitting at home and watching television going up. The next book that Putnam did that was absolutely critical to understanding American social systems was American Grace, How Religion Divides Us and Unites Us. This is a look at the changes of American religion. And indeed, Putnam was the first person to put his finger firmly on the idea of what's happening in American religion. You'll notice there, no religious preference is the blue line. It is absolutely skyrocketing. Even evangelical Protestantism has been going down. And this is a little more complex view of what's been happening in the United States. Evangelicals, still a very high number of people participating in churches, but even that trending down. Roman Catholicism, despite immigration, trending down. Right there in the middle, no religion shooting straight up all the time. It's now even higher than that. And mainline religions falling off fairly precipitously. A little bit of an upturn after the events of 2001. But now a decline once again. People of the Jewish faith, for example, flatlined, and many other faith traditions flatlined in terms of participation. And Putnam really began the discussion, why is this, how is this, and what does it actually mean to American social systems? And one of the things that he uses that is absolutely fascinating, we do have to put in some provisos about using it. You have to look closely at what it's actually measuring, but is books.google.com/ngrams. And this is a way of looking at a few different ways that language is being used. I'll show you some examples. And again, if you want to get the real data, you have to be a little bit more careful than I was. But I just simply looked it up, and these are instantaneous. What it does, the one that I used anyway, goes through all of the print material that Google has, and guess what? Google has a lot of print material. All right, so I looked up the word I, which is one of the things that Putnam deals with in his new book. Notice how the use of I trends in the U.S. We go all the way back to 1800, and this is adjusted. Of course, there's a lot more words coming out nowadays than there were in 1800 in the U.S., so this is adjusted for that. But notice the trend line for the use of the word I in print. It goes along and it begins to drop off around 1900s, going down. And this, of course, is the progressive era that is occurring with the muckrakers, with the idea of the social gospel that we've spent a lot of time on. And so the idea of I, or the use of I, begins to trend down. And it continues to trend down all the way until sometime around 1980. Now, that's kind of important to look at. And now, whoa, everybody's using I. It is trending straight up at the moment. Let's look at the use of the word we in print. Again, it was a fairly high usage back in 1800. It begins to trend down with U.S. society becoming more and more capitalistic and about me, me, me. It trends up a little bit around 1920. Notice that we do use the term we a lot at the beginning and going into the Second World War period. It trends along through the 1950s. And then again, oops, let's look, about 1964, and then it starts going down pretty precipitously and is now, since 2000, going back up again. So again, what happens in that little piece around a little bit after 1960? Don't want to skip this one. This is the word crisis used in print. You'll notice that the word crisis was fairly flatlined for quite a few years. It peaks around right before and during the First World War here in the United States. It precipitously goes up in the 1930s during the Great Depression. It's interesting, isn't it, that the word crisis in use drops off during the Second World War, but notice what it's doing nowadays. It's trending up and up and up. We think we have a crisis, and we're talking about it here in the U.S. So the question is what we most need. And I think that Putnam puts his finger on it probably. What we most need in the U.S. is to find a path to minority, multicultural nation. Now, how the heck does he come up with that recommendation? And I definitely agree with him on that. Well, he goes back to something that we don't think about and talk about all that much as a crisis point in the United States in the 1960s. You'll hear a lot about the Civil Rights Movement. We talk a lot about the Vietnam War and the divisiveness around the war. We don't talk so much about the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. You'll see the picture from the signing. Here's LBJ. We have Hubert Humphrey, his vice president over here. We have Robert Kennedy over here. It's kind of the high point of the progressive, left-leaning U.S. Foreign policy. And it abolished the national origins policy that had been in place since the 1920s, that had really shut off immigration from most of the world except for Europe. The fact is, though, that Europeans weren't coming to the U.S. Much after the Second World War period with Nazism. That dropped off very precipitously. And so what was it about this Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 that really changes ideas about what America is? Putnam's argument is that this is the high point of American confidence that we have a society that can sustain multiculturalism. And immediately there was a reaction against that. Now, the Census Bureau, this is in 2023, the immigrant share of the U.S. population will hit its highest level in U.S. history at 14.8% and will continue to rise. So the argument is that white America, if you will, is watching this trend and feeling more and more nervous about where multiculturalism is going to take us, and that begins to be the thing which Americans begin to vote against. All the way back in those days, Martin Luther King was already saying, we must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools. Sexist language of the 60s, but we must learn to be siblings together, or we will perish together as fools. He was, of course, reading the tea leaves, I think, correctly, because we do know after 1965, American politics begins to change. The 1968 election was definitely one in which we had a George Wallace who was openly racist and anti-immigrant. Richard Nixon was less so, more of a dog whistle on that, but he's the one who got elected after the Southern strategy that begins to change the Solid South into a Republican stronghold. Putnam argues that we went from an I to a we during the progressive era that lasted all the way until about 1965 and now has turned back into an I culture again, probably because of the of fear among Americans about what immigration and multiculturalism means. And so I believe that he's right about that, and that our work as progressives is to get back to a we. And how do we do that is to make ourselves talk about, deal with, and very much stand for a multicultural majority minority nation that definitely is in our future, probably about 2045 demographically, and that this is probably the way that we can get back to a we in America. But it's been a long road. And one of the interesting things about demographic trends, of course, is that you have to, what's happening now probably has a fairly long tail, as it says. But Putnam makes, I think, a fairly good case for this being the demographic shift that changed America into what we've been seeing in the last few years, which I think most progressives are not all that happy with. Thanks for listening today. We'll be talking more about that tomorrow, the idea of community, the idea of getting back to a we in American society. First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis was founded in 1881, if you don't remember. And since 1916, the society has been known as a leading force for religious humanism. Nowadays, we usually call it congregational humanism. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll be back tomorrow.